So breakfast now starts at 4 AM, which means we can no longer cook Sunday's dinner on Monday morning. Not legitimately without time traveling anyway. Whether time traveling still works, we don't know yet until we test it next Monday. So how else can we bring our ingredients from the previous week to feed them into a new week's Snorlax? Well, there is another method, and this has been kind of covered before, but not to this extent. And I'm talking about cooking power-up S. Now, this video is specifically about how to maximize your Monday morning's pot expansion. However, we do touch on Flareon and Glaceon, which is why this also happens to be part 7 of my Advanced Evolutions guide. Now, for those of you who are new to these videos, just so everyone's on the same page about why we want to do this, why we want to carry materials from Sunday to Monday, sacrifice some strength from the previous week, well, that's because we want to power up Snorlax as early as possible. Then for the rest of the week, you're going to get more spawns, better sleep styles, etc. You don't want to be starting from 0 and then building up very slowly. So where possible, you would prefer to sacrifice some Sunday materials so that you can use them on Monday. Because materials used on Sunday, for example, if you're dumping your entire ingredient bag for the 3 meals that have end of week bonus expansion and you have nothing left for Monday, all of those materials go into powering up that 1 or 2 sessions you've got left of the previous week. Whereas all that material could have been used to power up your Snorlax for a new week, in which case it can benefit every single session of the 7 days you have remaining. Now, we've actually already covered one very broken strategy, and that is using Raikor's Helper Boost skill in order to overstack your berries above the inventory limit and then dumping all of those ingredients and berries on a new week. Especially useful if we're going into a good event. And at max potential, this is still the strongest method to go about it. But there is a huge downside. For those of you who have tested this before or have tried to run this strategy before, you'll know that it takes days or weeks compared to other strategies, which is where this strategy comes in extra handy. This strategy's max potential can be achieved within 1 day without sacrificing weeks and weeks of drowsy power on your Snorlax. And what's interesting about this skill is that it's actually preferred that you have multiple Pokemon running this skill at the same time as opposed to having just one on your team. And I'm going to explain why in a moment. But what we're not covering today is whether cooking power up is actually good from a day-to-day basis. If you're just trying to cook that next meal with the higher recipe bonus, is it going to be better than comparing to a berry specialist with berry finding S? That's not what we're talking about today. In those situations, you might only just want to run one cooking power up Pokemon, but what we're talking about today, it's best that you run multiple of these Magnone, Flareon, Glaceon as much as you can towards the end of the week. Which means that yes, we can make comparisons between Glaceon, Flareon, Magnone to see who's better at the skill, but it doesn't matter too much because you might want all 3 at some point. Even if Magnozone's better than Glaceon and Flareon, you gotta think about, well, how are you gonna afford 5 Thunderstones in order to get 5 Magnozones? Thankfully, the game gives us some free Thunderstones, free Firestone, and a free Ice Stone, so you could save a lot of material and costs if you do one of each. But first, before we get into the strategy, let's talk about how this skill actually works. At first, it's pretty obvious how this skill works. If you're at level 6 of the main skill, simply you get to put an extra 27 ingredients into the pot every time this skill gets triggered. And if you run a good camp ticket, that number becomes multiplied by 1.5 times. So the way that the final pot size is calculated for every meal is like this. It depends on your base pot size, which is this number here. If you fully invested and you're very high rank, you should be at 57, plus the end of week bonus, which is just the base pot size again. So you just take the 57 times 2, plus the main skill, which is the cooking power up, times the number of times you've triggered before that meal. But you take the total of that, add it all together, and then you times by the camp ticket, which is 1.5 times. The maximum amount of pot expansion you can get from skill triggers is 200, which is why I wrote 200 here. So if we're looking at the maximum final pot size, it is a total of 471. So that's the current maximum pot size you can fit into one meal, which is like almost your entire ingredient bag. And people have done this before. So this post is from Yuki X Hidamari, who for the Valentine's event made the strongest meal, the macaron dish, and then dumped 300 plus tails and a lot of corn into their dish. And you can see here, I know it's Japanese, but the expand pot skill gave them 200 extra space in the pot. And then there's 57 from the end of week bonus, and then all of that gets multiplied together with the base pot by 1.5, which is the good camp ticket. Now, the reason why this number says 414 is because it is in addition to the base pot. So the 471 includes the base pot as well. So if you actually add 414 to 57, you will get 471, which is the maximum pot size. And you can see this here with the pot size being a total of 471. So you can get a sense that it can be a very powerful strategy by doing something like this, able to cook a dish with 471 ingredients, but bearing in mind that only what's in the recipe will count with recipe bonus, everything else just counts as base strength. However, there are some limitations. Number one, we already saw, the maximum you can get from cooking power up is 200 extra ingredients. The second problem is that every time you actually cook, the cooking power up skill goes away. What I mean by that is, even if you don't use the cooking power up, let's say you've got a base pot size of 57 and you triggered once, you got an extra 27 ingredients, and then you cook a dish that only requires 30 ingredients. The game doesn't let you keep that cooking power up for the next meal. In other words, in order to stack 200 extra ingredients via this skill, you can't cook at all until you're ready to use that cooking power up. The cooking power up will stack over and over again, and that's what we're talking about today. What we're talking about is how long we need to run these cooking power up skill specialists for in order to achieve that 200 expand pot, that 200 extra ingredients that you can put for Monday's first meal. And then we can compare and see if it's much less harmful to the previous week compared to using the Raikor strategy. So for those of you who don't want to dive into the maths, I will just give you the answer now. It will take about a day, and I'm not including sleep. I'm talking about like 12 hours of a day where you're constantly collecting skills if you have a full team of Magnazones. Oh, but if you have perfect stats, fully invested your main skill seeds into 5 Magnazones, it's a lot quicker than that. We're talking about as short as 3 to 4 hours and you'll be done getting plus 200 on your expand pot. So it's significantly less harmful to your previous week than using the Raikor strategy. However, it is also significantly weaker in comparison to Raikor's overstacking strategy at maximum potential. But also, these two skills aren't actually totally exclusive to each other. You could theoretically expand your pot to 200 and then swap out your team of expand pot specialists, then put in a Raikor with your team of berry specialists, then overstack them for 2 or 3 weeks, and then hopefully starting the 4th week Monday with both strategies intact, having 200 expand pot and Raikor overstacking the entire time. This is purely theoretical. I don't know if anybody will do something like this. This would absolutely be min-maxing like an event week or something like that, where you can drop tons and tons of thousands and thousands of berries to Snorlax and have this ingredient pot to cook that first meal. Do be aware though, it won't work the other way around, because if you run a Raikor, you shouldn't be running a bunch of skill specialists with it. you wouldn't be getting much berry strength or ingredient productions. It just wouldn't make sense, and skills don't get triggered by Raikor's skill as far as I'm aware. And even if they could, because it's an overstacking strategy, skills just don't trigger when the inventory is at maximum on the Pokemon anyway. So cooking pot expansion needs to be done before Raikor's strategy is employed. Now let's dive into the numbers. Who is the best cooking power-up specialist right now? And it is Magnezone, who also happens to have 3 evolutionary stages, which means your main skill level will be level 3, saving you 1 main seed compared to the evolutions Glaceon and Flareon. So if you're purely looking at just investing in a cooking power-up Pokemon, Magnezone is the one of choice. However, they're not too different to each other. Using these really good stats for skill specialist, main skill chance up, helping bonus, helping speed M, and skill trigger M, Magnezone triggers about on average 7.6 times in a day, whereas Glaceon 7.5 and then Flareon 7.3, so they're very close to each other. I'd actually say the difference is so small that actually the main deciding factor of which one you choose should be just favorite berries. Which one actually provides you with more strength and berries, or even favorite berries for the areas you want to target. So if you're missing some team members for Taupe Hollow, Flareon is a good choice. This has always been the case because Taupe Hollow is actually quite difficult to create a good team for, since Cyndaquil is so rare, Onix is also rare, and that just leaves us with Marowak. Or if you need a team for Snowdrop Tundra, Glaceon is a good choice as well. But furthermore, it doesn't actually hurt if you want to get all 3, Magnezone, Flareon, and Glaceon, because of this strategy to power up the next week. And as I said before, if you invest in one of each, you can just use your free-to-play achievement like Thunderstone, Ice Stone, and Firestone without having to buy too many of the Thunderstones in order to create like a whole team of Magnezones. Let's talk about Magnezone without any main skill investment, main skill seeds investment. Each time you trigger cooking power up, you get 12 extra ingredients because it's got 2 evolutions. So it ends up at skill level 3. So now we want to know how many triggers that equates to. So let's say we want 200 total expanded pot, which is the maximum. If we divide that by 12, we want 16.7 triggers from a Magnezone. But of course, we can be running 5 Magnezones. So let's say we divide that by 5. Each Magnezone only has to trigger 3.3 times. And then we're going to look at how many times a Magnezone can trigger in a day. So let's focus on Magnezone here. Under my settings right now, it's 7.8 times. But my settings here includes sleeping hours, which cannot trigger any main skill according to the calculator. It makes sense. When you're sleeping, you can't collect the productions on the Pokemon. So in order for me to do this calculation, what I do is I set my sleeping time to almost 0. So let's say I want my sleep hours to be between 12 AM to 12:01, and I set my healing to 100% so that I know if my Magnezone were at 100% energy all day in 24 hours, how many times it can trigger that skill. So the calculator tells me that Magnezone with really good stats, almost ideal stats, and 4 helping bonus Pokemon on its team, it can trigger nearly 11 times in a day. So if I only want 3.3 times out of that, so I divide by 10.69, I just need to run Magnezone about 31% of the day of 24 hours. So that equates to about 7.5 hours. So with 5 Magnezones on the team, it would only take about 7.5 hours for me to reach 200 expanded pot. But that was only using level 3 main skill. It gets much better if you have maximum skill level. Now let's truly look at the maximum potential of Magnezone. So we're going to restart the calculation from start. We want 200 expand pot in total, which is the maximum. Let's say each trigger gives us 27, which means in total, I need 7.4 triggers. But let's say there are 5 Magnozones on the team, then each Magnozone only has to trigger 1.5 times. Since Magnozone can trigger like 10-11 times in a day, that means that if I divide this by 10.69, I only need Magnozone for about 14% of 24 hours. So let's times 24 hours. I only need Magnozone, a full team of max potential Magnozone, for 3.5 hours. Then I'll have my plus 200 expand pot on average. So the reason why I keep saying we're going to run 5 Magnozones on the team, and it's not to say that you have to do 5 Magnozones, you can have a Glaceon, you can have a Flareon, and then you can have a Magnozone, maybe 2 Magnetons, it's up to you. But the reason why I keep saying you have to run 5 Expand Pot Specialists is that in that way, you don't have to skip many meals. If you only run 1 Magnozone on the team in order to get 200 Expand Pot, it would take you 5 times longer. So if we compare to the 3.5 hours, it's about 16.5 hours in order to run 1 Magnozone to achieve the same result. But during those 16.5 hours, remember, you can't cook, which means more sacrifice on your previous week's Snorlax. Imagine if you can't cook Sunday breakfast, lunch, and dinner at all for your Sunday, just so you can run 1 Expand Pot Specialist all day to try and get to that plus 200 maximum, as opposed to running 5 Expand Pot Specialists after your dinner is cooked on Sunday. I'm assuming you guys have enough ingredients to cover all of this, but let's say you've actually cooked Sunday's breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and then you run a full team of 5 Magnozone after 6 p.m. By the time you're ready to go to sleep, let's say 9-10 p.m., those Magnozones, as long as you're collecting the skill very often and maximum potential, will be able to get to 200 Expand Pot, effectively almost not nerfing your previous week Snorlax at all. In fact, theoretically, if you start your sleep with a Pokego Plus and then spend a few hours collecting Magnozone after you've already started tracking, you haven't even affected your Snorlax strength from the previous week at all. But let's assume that you were going to reach the inventory limit anyway on your Pokemon. You might as well run a few Magnozone or Glaceon, Flareon for a few hours, collect those skills, and I'm assuming you're not sleeping at that point to do this, otherwise this wouldn't work. But this is just a hypothetical. And then you swap out your Magnozone team once you've got enough cooking power up, back to your normal Sunday sleep team so that you can carry over the berries and stuff to the new week. Then you can still achieve very good results without harming your previous week's Snorlax. And now, let's compare that to how good Raikor's Helper Boost Electric skill is for overstacking. Which one will do better short-term versus long-term? Before we dive into that comparison, I must mention that the Sunday bonus, which would be plus 57 if your pot size is 57, may not work for Monday anymore, and if it doesn't, then you don't get this plus 57, in which case your total pot size at maximum would be 414, including a good camp ticket. And to be fair, if you're using the Raikor strategy, it doesn't mean you can't cook breakfast at all. So the only number we're comparing is main skill number here, and we'll give it an extra benefit of using good camp ticket. So 200 times 1.5, which means 300 extra ingredients. And because they're going to be extra ingredients, we cannot apply recipe bonus in this comparison. But what we can do is assume that all 300 extra ingredients are Slowpoke tails, and really look at the max potential of this 200 extra pot size. And 300 extra ingredients all being Slowpoke tails. I'm assuming you can even farm that much, but let's give it the maximum potential. It's a total of 102,000 strength, which is huge. But this is the absolute limit of using this strategy. Whereas if we use the Raikor strategy, yes, it's a lot more harmful for many days and weeks beforehand, but let's say your entire team has 999 berries and ingredients, and I'm just going to count berries just for simplicity. The numbers are going to be overwhelming anyway, so it shouldn't matter that some are ingredients, but let's say all 999 are berries times 14 members. Let's use grappa berry as our example. So if they're all grappa berries at level 55, all grappa berries will give 95 strength. That's if there's no favorite. Then you end up with a maximum potential of 3.5 times more than the expand pot strategy. The great thing about the expand pot strategy is you don't have to not play the game for weeks at a time. To build up that many berries takes a long time. Then again, if your berries are favorite, well, then we're looking at double that, which is again huge. So let's say you got 4 BFS Meganiums that you're carrying into Lakeside for an event. You could be looking at 500,000 Snorlax strength to start the week off. Now, bear in mind that for fair comparison, I don't usually include area bonus. Of course, if you got like 40% or 50% area bonus, both strategies will be boosted equally by 50%. Now, to be fair, I could have given the expand pot a chance to crit as well. Usually what we do is we add either 10% or 17% to the strength to give us the weighted average crit chance. But I think without Sunday bonus these days, that's wishful thinking to think that you're going to be able to crit that huge pot. But some people may run Dedenne. Unfortunately though, Dedenne's skill, which is to increase the chance to crit, has a few issues. One of them being that you can't carry over Dedenne's skill from Sunday to Monday. It gets reset. So it kind of doesn't help you unless you're able to time travel so that you spend a long time in Monday to trigger that Dedenne skill, cook breakfast at the latest time possible, and you use that whole 24 hours to trigger Dedenne skill as much as you can. Before then, you cook your first meal. It sounds insane because it is in order to do something like that. And now just to show you guys what actually ended up happening to Yuki Hidamari's massive pot breakfast. And well, this will include area bonus. I'm not sure what the area bonus is. They did land a crit. Their crit is a Sunday crit that they use for Monday, which shouldn't work anymore because of bug patches and so on. If it does, great. But if it doesn't, then what would happen is if you crit, then this number gets doubled. If they crit, they got triple because it's a Sunday bonus. So they ended up with 1 million Snorlax strength to start the week off. And you can actually see that they run multiple expand pot specialists and probably a Vaporeon to help fill up the pot. And probably how they farm so many Slowpoke tails is by running the Vaporeon. So in summary, expand pot specialists, you can almost not have too many of them. You can have up to 5 on your team, and that would minimize the amount of time you lose having to run these Pokemon in order to expand pot for the Monday. It is a good alternative strategy to overstacking, but at max potential, it doesn't beat overstacking. The problem with overstacking using Raikou skill is that it just harms your previous week or week's Snorlax so much that unless your previous week you're actually trying to keep the drowsy power low, and some people do that in order to encounter certain spawns that actually have low drowsy power. And the reason why that's a good thing is to minimize variety. So for example, I'm sure some of you have seen how many Rattatas can spawn at Snowdrop Tundra when you first go there because your drowsy power is so low, because there's just so few variety for the game to pick from. So keeping a low drowsy power can have some advantages. So if you use Raikou's skill, you should combine it with weeks where you're trying to farm certain Pokemon where they spawn more at low drowsy power. But that's not topic for today's video, so thank you for watching, guys. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments section below. I hope you found this useful. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and you can support the channel now by becoming a member by clicking the join button, and I'll see you in the next video.